I've come and tried to give you an update on what the legislature did to you for this past term. So here we go for 2025. So I have to say it every year. You know, what the legislature does is very important to utility districts, municipal utilities, county utilities, any utility that operates that's a governmental entity. Because as a governmental entity, you can only act to the extent the legislature has authorized you to act. And if the legislature tells you how to do something, you're bound to do that. So a little different than private businesses. I like to think of it as a private lots of legislation of the session. So probably spent more time this year than I'm going to try to talk about 3 or 4 bills because I'm afraid that's as much as I can really get through to try to explain those. But there was more that was passed. Beginning this year, TAUD puts out a weekly legislative express that sort of keeps you up to date as to bills that are filed and what happens with those. That is now on the website. If you get on the website, you can look at the final legislative express for the year, and it will basically give you a list of what actually passed that affected you as a utility. You know, not all of them, if you're a utility district, may not all of them affect you, city, but you can read through those. There's a summary there. So I'm going to elaborate on about 4 or 5 if I can do it quickly. But I won't be able to cover everything. So I want to refer you to that. You look at them, and I'm always around. If you have a question afterwards or about something you read, feel free to just let me know. So, um, for you all that have training, and a lot of you all, that's why you're here. Since 2010 for utility district commissioners, and since 2017 for board members of municipals or county governing board members, you've been required to have 12 hours of initial training first year after your appointment or election. And then every 3 years, you've been required to get 12 additional hours. So really, this was the only bill that TAUD really was instrumental in introducing this year to really reduce the number of hours during that 3 year continuing education period from 12 to 6. It's really something that's probably needed to be done for a while. You know, when that requirement first came in, it came in at the first time training was required. But over the years, at least my personal experience has been 12 hours is too much to require sort of as an ongoing continuing education process. So, um, beginning beginning once this was passed, your 3 year continuing education requirement is no longer 12 hours, it is 6. Your original 12 hours is the same, only affects the continuing education requirement that you've got every 3 years. The effective date of that law was April 11th, 2025. So 3 years is a substantial period of time. So if you are currently, whatever continuing education period you are currently in, that's gone from 12 to 6. So your 3-year continuing education period ends the end of 2025. You don't have any hours so far. All you got to do is get 6. If you're, if you had 6 hours in 2024, before this session, you may have thought, I got to get 6 more hours. You got your 6 for your current continuing education period. Okay. So no opposition to that. No, the comptroller was had no opposition to our desire to do that. So that's a new change. So it's already in effect. So I would encourage you all, if you are a board member and you don't know what your continuing education period is, you need to educate yourself about what that is. Hopefully your manager or somebody in the office knows. But I can tell you from my experience, a lot of people don't know what it is, even in the office. Continuing education periods are on the calendar year, which means that doesn't have anything to do with the date that you became appointed as a commissioner. You were appointed in April and you take your first 12 hours in November, your first continuing education period starts January 1 of that next year. So if you're appointed April 2025, you get 12 hours at the TAUD Utility Leadership Conference, November 2025. Your first 3-year continuing education period begins January 1 of 2026. And that calendar year, that 3 years, is going to continue to roll from January 1 each year. You get reappointed, doesn't mean anything when it comes to how your continuing education period begins and ends, because it's always going to be on a calendar year. After the training requirement came into effect for utility district commissioners in 2010, there was a penalty that was put in place by that legislation. The penalty for failing to get either the initial 12 hours or to get 12 hours each 3-year continuing education period was you were no longer eligible to serve. Meaning that there was really nothing that could be done for you to become re-eligible again if you missed your training. With some frequency, new commissioner would be appointed. First 12 hours is required within 1 year of that initial appointment. If you miss the 1 year, you're in year 2 of your 4-year term. But if you didn't get your 12 hours, you are already term limited because you didn't get the initial 12 hours. So this year, really through a legislator in West Tennessee who had a sympathetic ear to a utility district commissioner, wanted some method to be set up for a utility district commissioner who was no longer eligible to serve to become re-eligible. So this statute just sort of creates that mechanism. So if you are ineligible to serve because you are a utility district commissioner, only talking about utility district commissioners, then you can achieve eligibility again. The way you do that is you file a petition for reinstatement with the Tennessee Board of Utility Regulation, the T-Board. The T-Board has to require that you get 12 hours of training. The T-Board puts out an order that says when your reinstatement goes into effect, and they can also include other terms and conditions of your reinstatement. That's a very general language. So it was general for a reason. So if you're no longer eligible to serve, then you can become re-eligible again by filing a petition with the T-Board to request you becoming re-eligible and in essence, do what they ask you to do. However, you can't file that petition until you have set out at least one term. So in the example that I gave you, you're appointed to the Utility District Commissioner Board, you miss your training because you don't get it in the first year, you already know you're term limited, because the penalty before this came up, the penalty is you can't serve again. You can't file this petition to become re-eligible until after you've set out another 4-year term. Use the reinstatement to sort of get yourself qualified for the next term at which you might be reappointed. Okay. How much this will be used, I don't know, but it's there. So this was a bill, Public Chapter 480, that came a little bit out of the blue. And this was what I spent a lot of time on this past session. And it's a bill that deals with a couple of aspects of utility infrastructure for new developments. So the bill's got several provisions in it. And so I'm going to give a quick summary of what those are. This bill was written by someone that has an interest in development. This bill uses terms that, especially sometimes for water and sewer, it's like, well, what does that mean? I like to say it's got some squishy language in it in several places. Squishy language means how it's interpreted is going to wind up being, or what it means may wind up in how it gets interpreted down the road. So we're going to walk through what it actually provides for. I'll give a little bit of how parts of it is how it got there. So really deals with approval by a utility of plans for a new development. And also the second part it addresses is the construction of new utility infrastructure for new developments. Okay. If a utility does not customarily prepare infrastructure plans and designs for a new development, then the utility relies upon the developer and the developer's engineer to say, here's the plans for the new development. Once those are submitted to you as the utility, you've only got 60 days to make your review of the infrastructure for the new development. Prior to this being passed, there was no time frame within which you as the utility had to review the design that the developer submitted. And this is not only for water and wastewater, it's for electric infrastructure and natural gas infrastructure. So there is now a time limit within which you've got to review the utility infrastructure plans for a new development. New development's not particularly defined, in this new law. Hopefully everybody knows what it is, but I can assure you that question is going to come up. So it applies when the utility does not customarily prepare the plans and designs for the development. I personally know of some utilities where they do the plan and designs themselves. The developer comes to them. That information is then given to the utilities engineer who actually does the plan and design. If that's true, this time frame and this process that I'm describing is not going to apply to you. This applied to all types of public utilities: water, wastewater, electric, gas, and even stormwater. The genesis of this bill was from an area where, a high growth area involving a municipality. So you're going to see language that sort of makes sense from if you're thinking about a big municipal utility. So there were representatives and lobbyists for the electric co-ops, representatives and lobbyists for the Municipal Electric Association, the Tennessee Gas Association, TAUD. Meetings on this bill would have at least a dozen people sometimes in them, each one having their own real concern. So sometimes the concern of the electric utilities was, well, that's not a big deal for water and wastewater, but then something that was not a big deal for them was a big deal for us. So, like most legislation, it was a compromise in lots of ways. So, a time frame has been developed in which you've got to review the plans submitted by a developer for new development. So, if you don't complete that review within 60 days, what happens? The developer has the ability to go and hire what's called a third-party plans examiner. And who is a third-party plans examiner? Registered professional engineer with expertise in utility infrastructure. That's the definition, folks. Okay. Now, it actually does have some considerations about what that person is supposed to be. But the kicker for the utilities is if you don't meet the 60 days, then the developer can hire the third party plans examiner to review what the developers come up with to say whether it meets all the qualifications, all the requirements that you have for the infrastructure. Now, the new act uses the language state and federal regulatory requirements, codes, clearly a municipal thing, and local requirements. So for your utility district, some of that language doesn't mean a lot to you, but whatever rules and regulations you have in place for a developer, and that's going to come under the local requirements. It's your local requirements. Okay. So you miss the 60 days, this is what kicks in. A third party has the ability to come in and sort of do their own self-review of what your requirements are and any other regulatory requirements are to see whether they meet those. So if that occurs, eventually the third party examiner is going to come to you with a report that says, we've reviewed the plans of the developer, we've reviewed all of your requirements, and we've reviewed everything else. We think that these plans and designs of the developer are sufficient for the new subdivision that you're going to serve. At that point, you got 10 days to do one of three things. You can either approve the plans that the third party plans examiner has said is okay. You can provide the developer with a list of deficiencies, meaning you didn't address this. What about this? Or you can request additional information. You've given me the report, but what about this and this and this? So you've got to do one of those three things within 10 days after that third party plans examiner submits that report to you. If you don't, then the development plans that the third party plans examiner has reviewed and said are sufficient for the new subdivision or the new development are deemed approved by you. So that is the got to take my watch off so I can look at the time of the review of plans for new development. So now, as I said in the beginning, this procedure does not apply when the utility customarily does the plans and designs for the development itself, either on the date that this became effective or adopt such a policy thereafter, meaning a policy where you will review you will prepare the plans and designs for new development, not accept, but the developer submits because that's what starts this whole process for review. Again, what does that policy have to have? It's silent, but you can do it in the future. It's one of those. There were several little catch-alls in here with squishy language to try to address something that people didn't know how to address. This was one of those. So part one of this bill was process for the review of new infrastructure for new developments, whether it's electric, gas, wastewater, water. The second part of this bill deals with the actual construction of utility infrastructure for new development. This one was a really big deal for the electric and the gas folks. It was less of a big deal for the water and wastewater folks, and you'll see why. So, first thing the Act provides for is it says that gives the developer, the right to hire its own contractor to install the infrastructure within the new development. Now, for almost all water and wastewater utilities that I'm aware of, that's the normal practice. With your oversight, you let the developer hire the contractor to put in the infrastructure for the new development. That was not something that a lot of the electrics did. It's also an issue with the gas folks as well because of all their regulatory requirements that they have to follow through for the installation of gas lines. So, has to be a contractor in good standing that you've approved or just somebody that you've approved. Now, there's a bunch of other requirements that make sense. The contractor has to have insurance of a certain amount, and they have to have performance and payment bonds in place, and they have to have the proper licensing from the state, all in addition to sort of being somebody that you approve. That one's not as big of a deal for water and wastewater utilities as it was for the other types of utilities. Especially from the electric standpoint, there was a little bit of an exception in there to allowing the developer to use its contractor for the infrastructure installation. And that is, the utility can do the direct installation when it ensures, quote, public safety or service reliability, whatever that means. Okay. One of those, that's another squishy language in this bill, or by an approved contractor, but you are there, directing exactly what's being done. So, next aspect of this bill that deals with the construction part of the utility infrastructure for new development is the utility cannot require materials or services for construction provided by a specific vendor or manufacturer unless deemed necessary for the quality and integrity of the system. That one was a bit of a negotiation because when this bill first came out, it was that the utility could not provide or could not require specific materials or, or specifications or the providers of those. So the compromise was, well, you can't do that except when it's deemed necessary by the utility for quality and integrity. Again, squishy language, but this squishy language is in our favor, okay? Because that's all it says. Okay. If you are in that context where the third-party plans examiner is the one that has approved the development plans, and that's how it's progressed forward, it gives the utility the ability to inspect the construction work that the developer's contractor is doing. For utility, for water and wastewater, that's like, yeah, we have to, we're required already by TDEC to do that inspection. But this was a big deal for the electric and gas folks because there was no state agency that required the inspection of the utility infrastructure, you know, especially those that did all of it on their own. They didn't need the inspection because they did it themselves. So, and if you are going to do the inspection in this context, you can charge a reasonable fee. The original bill that was put in had a limit on what the inspection fee could be. It also had a limit on what you could charge a developer for the review of plans and specifications. So this language was sort of a compromise to just say you can charge a reasonable fee for the inspection. Okay. And then one final sort of squishy phrase that says all of this procedure about how utility infrastructure approval for new development and the construction of utility infrastructure for a new development that I've just described, those don't apply if they conflict with some kind of state or federal regulatory requirement, which is good. I'm not sure how it would ever come up, but it's good. So the other thing, because like I said, this is a lot to take in a short time period. I think the other thing to remember, because as we were going and looking at this, thinking, this is bad, this is bad. Wait, this came from, it's a big change. So anyway, it's out there. So all of a sudden, so you won't be hit blindsided when some developer comes in and says, well, you've got to start doing this, 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 and this. At least you'll know, oh, I think I heard something about that. Don't take what the developer says at face value. Check out what it is you do and what it is you don't have to do. Okay. Okay. A couple of years ago, there was a bill that passed that required some new, I guess, transparency requirements for the governing bodies of cities and counties. Which for you all, city council, mayor and board of aldermen meeting, county commission. And it basically dealt with two or three things I'm going to talk about here. And that bill was done in 2023. There was an amendment that was done that sort of exempted out a lot of other governing boards, utility districts being one of them, other utility boards, E991 boards, so that it just applied to the governing bodies of cities and counties. That existing law got amended to basically now apply to any governmental entity in the governing board of any type of local government. So what those requirements that were in 2023 that have now been incorporated really deal with a couple things. First, at least 48 hours before you have your board meeting, you have to make the agenda of your board meeting available to the general public. How do you make it available to the public? has to be publicly accessible. Publishing the agenda on your website is defined to be making it publicly accessible. So, at least 48 hours before your regular special board meeting, you're going to be required to post the agenda of the board meeting on your website. If you don't have a website, I guess the best you can do is make sure that's available in your office so a member of the public can come in and review it. You know, after at least 48, after the 2 days before the board meeting occurs. The new law says that the utility cannot act on something and cannot deliberate on something if it's not on that agenda that you made public 48 hours beforehand. Okay. That's what it says. It does have a provision that says, unless your own bylaws or there are other laws that permit you to act on an item that was not in the agenda that you published on your website or made available. Now, honestly, I don't really know what that means, because the whole idea is this is a part of the Sunshine Law, the Tennessee Open Meetings Act. I don't really know how you change that by adopting a bylaw. So I would be very wary of trying to meet this squishy language right here. Like a lot of legislation, it was done to try to make something look better. I don't really know if it has any real meaning or not. So in connection with that openness, it goes on to say, and you really can't withhold items from the agenda, to try to avoid a public discussion about the issue that you've left off the agenda. So again, a push for transparency. The item's got to be on the agenda. You can't act on or deliberate, if it's not on the agenda. So, and remember, why is that really important? It's important because remember, the penalty for not conducting your board meeting in accordance with the Sunshine Law means that your action is void. Okay. So if you act on an item that's not on the agenda, and I'm the attorney representing the party that's unhappy with what you did, what do? The first thing I do say, you violated the Sunshine Law. That action's void. So it's going to have the exact same penalty that the failure to give public notice of a meeting does, right? Because it's been incorporated in the Sunshine Law. Yeah. Well, so the question is, what if you have an emergency? Okay. Unfortunately, the statute doesn't say an exception for an emergency. Now, because, it's going to be it may be a little difficult to come up with an emergency that you didn't know that was, more than 48 hours before the meeting. However, if somebody came to me and said, what do we do with an emergency? I'd take my bylaws and I would say, emergency considerations of things that aren't on the agenda, which we can act on are, and I would list them. Because then you can say, oh, I complied with the change in the Sunshine Law. We changed our bylaws to sort of say what was an emergency action needed, which really for you all means not on the agenda at least 48 hours beforehand. And then you list it. That's the way I'd address it.
brought up. Surely we're not going to say, well, but publish, so next particulars come back next month.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, what do we do if a customer comes? We're now required to have a public comment period. Not now the public comment period is supposed to be based upon items on the agenda. But what do? The customer appears and like the customer's asking you to do something. Clearly it wasn't on the agenda because you didn't know what the customer was going to ask for. That's a really difficult issue to address with the language of this statute. Because I always want to take the other side. And the other side of that is, well, the Sunshine Law says that, you're required to have a public comment period for the public for for matters that are, quote, germane to the agenda. Now, a lot of you all are used to just saying, well, you all can come, and you just open it up, which makes sense if a member of the public comes. And so the only safe thing you can do is say, not on our agenda. We'll take it up by Tennessee law from acting on anything that's not on the agenda of our meeting. If you'd have let me know what you were going to ask for, a week before the board meeting, I could have put it on the agenda, but you didn't. That's how I would address it. Right, let's see. Okay. Yes, sir. Yep. That's a really good question. Yeah. So the question was, this new law says publication on the website at least 48 hours beforehand complies with making the agenda publicly accessible. Does that mean that you can use the website to comply with the public notice of the meeting requirement? The answer to that is I don't really know, because all the Sunshine Law says is that you have to give, quote, adequate notice of a meeting. All it says. The courts that have interpreted that have said, well, what's adequate depends upon the context in which the item came up. In other words, there is no bright line. Now, over the last couple of years, there's actually been some language in a couple of bills that would say just what you want it to say, and that is publication on the website, is a proper location for publication of the notice of the in our case the board meeting, but that's not in the law. Okay, so I can't really give you an answer to that, because I think you can make a good argument that if you put it on the website, especially if you're a utility district where you put it on your bill, you've probably let the public know in sufficient time that there's going to be a public meeting. And since the agenda's on the website, you actually know what's going to happen. But that's not anything the legislature has actually done. So, you're going to be, if that becomes an issue, you're just going to be put in the context, and you're going to put in the position of having to explain why that was good public notice. I'm sort of okay with making that, but really 2 days is not very long. So the timing, notice is timing and location. That's the timing is difficult, if you just do it 2 days beforehand. But the location's a pretty good location because, newspaper notification, not nearly as effective as the website. But as of yet, the legislature has not spoken to that. Maybe someday. Okay. This was another bill that just sort of came out of the blue, and I'm going to talk about what it does and get through it real quick. So, there was a bill that was introduced that basically said this bill's got two parts to it. That if a municipal utility has been providing sewer service outside of its boundaries of 25 years, it cannot abandon that service when it's established that the sewer utility has the capacity to provide the service. That's about the language that the original bill used. Now, the purpose behind the bill was really to um, require new developments in an area outside the boundaries of a city where they had been providing service for a long time, you know, to continue to provide the service, new service in that area. There are some cities that they won't provide sewer service outside their municipal boundaries. Some places they do. And then, of course, some folks have hit the experience of, okay, I want sewer service, and the city goes, we don't really want to provide that service. And, we're no longer providing service to new developments outside of our boundaries. So it became an impediment in a particular situation to someone that was wanting service. They were sort of saying, well, you've been out here outside your boundaries for 25 years providing sewer service. Why are you denying me that service just because I'm not in your boundaries? So this was the fix. Okay. Originally, it was just like, if you've been serving, you got to serve it. Okay. So, yes, only wastewater, because that's the particular issue it was trying to address. So, and really, a lot of times, it's the sewer that's a bigger problem for the municipality, than providing water, but not always. So, if you've been serving, municipal utility, and I use the word municipal, but it does say city or town, then, you know, you have got to provide service at the request, and it doesn't say a developer, whether it's a customer or developer, provided that the T board determines that there's sufficient capacity of the sewer utility to provide the service. That was not uh, in the initial bill. And the reason that was sort of an easy, hopefully it was a way to sort of address this, was there was already back in 2023 a change made to the to the TBOR that allows the TBOR to take a complaint from a customer slash developer if they've been refused service. So it was sort of a power that already existed to, if you were denied service, you can go to the utility and say, I want service. And the utility says no, then you have already had an appeal to the TBOR. So what we sort of did with this bill was to try to amend it to incorporate that existing procedure. Now, that existing procedure only came into effect in 2023, maybe only been used once or twice so far. So, in the scenario, municipal wastewater utility, you've been providing service outside your boundaries for 25 years. Somebody comes and requests service, you know, if you deny service, then they have the right to file a complaint with the TBOR saying, I was denied service. I should not have been denied service. And TBOR has the power to review that and actually hold an informal hearing on the question, does the sewer utility have the right to provide service to this customer slash developer that's made this request? in this area that they have been serving outside of their boundaries for at least 25 years. So both parties have the opportunity to present whatever studies, reports that they want to on the issue of whether there is sufficient capacity to provide the sewer service that's being requested by the owner, the customer slash developer. Then the T-Board makes that determination as to whether there is sufficient capacity. So that's the sort of the procedure that's going to be followed when you meet that criteria. So I guess not 24 years, but 25 years. Okay. It's was designed to address a specific issue, but it's so the way that that's going to be handled if there's a dispute between the customer slash developer and the sewer utility that wants new service in the area is if the utility denies it, then the customer slash developer has the right to appeal to the T-Board, and the T-Board will hear whatever information you present and the developer presents, and they're going to make a determination as to whether there's sufficient capacity to provide the service. And the T-Board is given the power to order such, quote, remedial actions as necessary to address the denial of service. Very squishy language. What is it meant by remedial actions? Doesn't say. This is a very broad power that's been given to the T-Board. And this language has been used in a couple other locations within their statutes as well. And I can be running out of time, so I'm going to go real quick. Because the author of this bill didn't really know what he was doing, he also had a provision in it that tried to provide the same thing if a utility district served within an incorporated area of a county for 25 or more years. Well, duh, that's what utility districts do. They serve in unincorporated areas. It just didn't make a whole lot of sense, but since it wasn't a real problem, it just got left alone and just incorporated that same process. Okay. My opinion, very poorly drafted. Okay. This bill has another part to it, again, dealing with sewer utility. It basically said a sewer utility that has an existing main on a piece of property, which I'm going to say also means adjacent to it on the right of way. If an owner asks for service, you have to provide it. That's what the initial bill provided for. So, sort of incorporating that same procedure that I just described before the T-Board, sort of the original bill was amended to sort of say, well, if the utility, if the manager says we can't serve it, you can go to the board and ask the board to, let you have service because you meet the requirements, sewer utility, existing gravity main on your property, the obligation to serve. They can go through this same process. The T-Board will hold a hearing on whether you should have to provide service to this owner of property, and they will make a decision based upon what they hear. So again, very specific. As you can probably tell from the way I'm describing it, very developer driven, dealing with wastewater service. In this particular instance, as we were trying to develop the compromise, the pusher of the bill says, well, I've got a situation where the city won't act. Once we said we want service, and the city just kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. So there was a provision that was added to address that says, if you get the request in this scenario and your city, you've only got 60 days to say no. If you don't say no, they can go to the T-board. Okay, real quickly, I'm going to try to hit a couple more and we'll end. Really, for the first time, the legislature, through the comptroller's office, has authorized the issuance of debt for emergency cash flow to meet operating expenses. Historically, debt has only been allowed for capital improvements, not for operating expenses. Okay. So this is looked at as a very temporary cash flow problem, that a utility may have. And so, if you, let's just take an example, what the language says is that, the amount that you're borrowing, the principal amount can't be more than 60% of what you anticipate your cash flow needs are going to be for the next year. Now let's take September 1. We think our cash flow is going to be at existing rates. We're going to have $100,000 over the next year. So the max that you can borrow to meet those operating expenses is not the 100,000, it's the 60,000, because it can only be 60% of whatever your anticipated cash flow is. And you've got to pay that off within a year. So by August 31st of 2026, you're going to have to pay off that note. So it's a very short-term borrowing that's done for immediate cash flow needed for emergency purposes. It comes with a couple of things you might want to think about before you do it. Yeah. So the question is from the Greenville Water Commission, what about a hurricane? I can't answer that one right now, but that would be the kind of situation where you would want to be able to do that. And because occasionally it just comes up. And what happens is if you need to borrow the money on a short-term basis, there's no statutory authorization to do that because borrowings have typically only been for capital improvements. So if you do that, along with getting the approval, you've got to come up with a corrective action plan to propose to the comptroller to say, well, we're needing this emergency cash now, and this is how we're going to correct our cash management and cash reserve situation that we're, now asking you to approve money for. And it will also trigger a referral to the T-board. Obviously, if you're having problems meeting cash flow, the comptroller says we're putting you under the review of the T-board. And that wonderful language that we just saw a minute ago, and the T-board can issue an order putting in place any remedial measures that are needed to address the utility. So, if you do that, you're going to pop before T-board, and they're going to be able to sort of take some significant control of, and whatever else they now have the authority to do. Is that Mike Corley? Somebody's hands up. It's like a 12-month period from the time you do the borrowing is what it looks like. So, and there is a provision that at the end of the 12 months, you can ask for more time, but the comptroller would have to approve it. Okay. One more, and then I'm going to stop. We had at the beginning, one of the things that we talked about was utility commissioners, penalties. There has for a while, the UMRB and then the T-board, they have had the power to remove utility district commissioners from office in some form of misconduct or failure to provide adequate oversight in the operation of utility. But that has only applied to utility districts. Sort of stuck in this bill I just described that dealt with borrowing money for emergency cash flow was a little provision that was stuck in there that basically now gives the TBOR the authority to remove a member of the governing body of any governmental utility when when they find one of the following situations occurs. Failure to comply with the conflict of interest statute, failure to exercise reasonable oversight of the utility. That one's the one that's in existence for utility districts now. Managerial incompetence is defined in the statute. Failure to follow board directives, meaning T-board directives, unless there's a good reason why. And another squishy language, any other reason provided by law. So what that means is that that same power that the T-board has had to remove utility district commissioners has now been expanded to the municipal utility boards, county boards of public utilities that were not, that were not subject to that. And they've expanded a little bit the grounds upon which that can be done. The only person that it doesn't apply to is the governing body of a utility board where that board member is elected. So especially think in terms of not always smaller utilities, but if the governing body of the city is the governing body of the utility, this removal is not going to happen because they are elected. Same thing would be true with the few tiny small county systems that provide water service. If they don't have a county board of public utilities, that's the governing body of the water and wastewater service, it would be the county commission that is that governing body. They're elected. So this is an expansion in a couple of ways, and how that will move forward, we'll find out how it moves forward. But it sort of brings all the other governmental utilities at that same place that utility districts have been, where the T-board has the ability to remove members, and sort of list the specific reasons. And with that, I'm going to stop because my time is out. So there are a few more, but these were the big ones. And feel free to follow up with me. You can email me, call me, whatever. I'm glad to tell you a little bit more about it. Some of them, it's just going to take time to figure out what it means. Thanks. And why don't y'all, I took up a lot of time, so why don't you all come back in about 3:05, 3:10, and then we'll start this last session of the day.